Hi, I'm Peter Miller, and I'm Dean of the Bard Graduate Center, and I'm here with Michele Majer, professor at the BGC and expert in fashion, dress, and textiles. My first question is, what kind of historical questions does fashion open up for us?
So I would say all kinds of questions related to social, cultural, economic, and political history, the history of consumption, questions of gender and representation. I would say that clothes and textiles have always mattered to the people who wore them, which is something that maybe before the 1980s was not always recognized by many historians because of clothes association with fashion. If I might relate a quick um, little incident, many decades ago when I was a student in the costume studies program at NYU, we had a guest lecture by a fairly well-known historian of the French Revolution. And at the end of her talk, one of my classmates asked her, well, what were they wearing? Somewhat facetiously, and the historian clearly thought this question was altogether irrelevant. And now we know that there is an extensive body of literature on dress during that period of political and social upheaval. So, and more recently, I would highlight the exhibition that the BGC did, French fashion women in the First World War, that was curated by Maud Bass-Kruger and Sophie Kurkdjian, and think of the kinds of questions that that exhibition asked. In addition to examining the wartime silhouette and how it changed from 1914 to 18, it explored it said, for instance, how important was fashion to the French economy? Well, it was so important that they didn't close it down during the First World War. In fact, they deliberately kept it going. And the change in the fashionable silhouette between 1914 and 1918 was part of the agenda to promote fashion consumption during that period. It also obviously looked at the role of women as, how were women participating in the fashion industry during this period, both in terms of producers and also consumers, and looking at the MediaNet strike of 1917. So questions about women's labor, the perception of women during this period, vis-a-vis fashion. On the one hand, they were being encouraged to consume fashion as a form of support, for the French economy. On the other hand, they were criticized for being overly attentive to, and perhaps unnecessarily, attentive to fashion during this time of national crisis. And that extended to mourning dress. So how were women perceived as widows? That became a real flashpoint during the period. So, and then I just think more broadly, sort of how women's roles, how did they change between 1914 and 1918 vis-a-vis the wider world, and how is that expressed actually through the clothes that they wear and what those clothes look like? So.
Right. How does knowing fashion from the inside, let's say, in terms of the materials, in terms of the ways dress is made, how does that let us do a different kind of fashion history?
Well, yes, I would say the clothes are more than just shapes and surfaces. And I'm not sure if this is a fair comparison, but it's one that occurred to me. Art historians have always placed great importance on not only a painting's subject matter and its iconography and so on, but also the brushwork of the individual artist. What kinds of brushes the artist was using, what kind of paints the artist was using, how does that artist create a particular effect on the canvas or surface, whatever it is. So it demonstrates an appreciation and understanding of that artist's technique. And if we think about some of the big name designers of the 20th century, like Poiret, Vionnet, Chanel, Dior, Balenciaga, Charles James, all of them approach dressmaking in a very individual way. And I don't think that we can appreciate and understand what they were doing unless we understand or include, their conception of what they were trying to achieve, and the ways in which they handled and manipulated fabrics and the kinds of fabrics that they used to achieve the silhouettes that they created. I was thinking of Lourdes Font's article that was published in West 86th Street in 2011 called Dior Before Dior. In the beginning of the article, she asked the question, what more can we possibly learn about Dior, who has been extensively written about by many fashion historians. And then she essentially undertakes a traditional art historical analysis and does a close reading of Dior's training and his early career and his very strong affinity for 19th century fashion that included 19th century fashion, 19th century dressmaking techniques. And that is all there in his work even before he presented his first collection in 1947. And I think it's in Seeing Through Clothes, Anne Hollander's book. And I do assign her work in a couple of my classes. She says at one point that how a garment is made doesn't really matter, that what is important is how it looks in its final visual effect. But I have to say, I completely disagree with that. I think it really does matter how a garment is made. That is integral to how the garment actually ends up looking. So Dior is a perfect example of that. There were two Dior exhibitions in the last few years, one at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which was a big, spectacular extravaganza. And there was one at the Royal Ontario Museum, curated by Alexander Palmer, which focused much more on the dressmaking techniques of Dior. And the labels included information, as detailed as how many hours it took to make the garment, how many yards of fabric were in a given skirt. And I think maybe some people would not be interested in that, but for me, that is a really important part of understanding a piece of clothing. And I was just thinking of one last thing that came into my head before this, is that in our recent Ginsburg catalog, we featured an 18th century dress, 18th century white damask, silk damask dress. And when it first arrived at the gallery and we were looking at it, the silk dates to about 1745 and the dress to about 1765, so it was slightly altered later. At the back of the shoulders here, totally embedded in the folds of the pleats at the back are two construction pins. You can only see about this much of the actual pin when you look in the lining inside. That was clearly an inadvertent mistake on the part of the dressmaker. But to me, it was extremely moving to have this trace of the hand of the woman who made this dress centuries ago, because it just was this visceral reaction that I had when I found those. Normally those would have been taken out after she had fitted the dress onto the client and so on. And you do sometimes still see dressing pins that would have been used, but to see the construction pins was really, really brought it home to me in a way that, there was a person who sat there in 17 whatever and stitched this dress. And that's a part of history that we don't necessarily remember so much when we look at a garment.
Right. I mean, it's clear to me that your many years of working at the Cora Ginsburg Gallery has given you this fantastic window into the materials and the ways of making of historical dress. And you've mentioned along the way a series of recent exhibitions that have focused more on the making, the ways of making of dress. And I guess I'd want to also just signal your own focus exhibition a few years ago on fashion and theater, which really enabled you to do that as a curator. So I'm wondering, just to pivot to a final question, thinking about these exhibitions of the last years, what do you think are the next questions or the new horizon for fashion research?
So I think as a category of dress study, I think that in the last decade or so, that menswear has become increasingly of interest. There have been, and I think will be, exhibitions of menswear, focusing strictly on menswear, which has not historically been, you know, a popular subject matter for exhibitions. I think that literature on menswear for a long time really essentially looked at the silhouette, the kinds of fabrics, sort of somewhat the details of construction, things like that, but didn't necessarily ask the same kinds of questions of menswear as of women's wear in terms of masculine identity, so issues around gender, issues around consumption, things like that. So I think that is certainly a growing area of interest in terms of fashion history, and also maybe the 21st century. So what is fashion itself? How do we understand fashion? Who is included in fashion? Where, when, how. I'm thinking of the project of one of our MA students who, for her qualifying paper this year, is looking at clothing and of indigenous peoples of the Northwest Coast, but talking about it in the context of fashion and fashionable dress and exchanges of fashion amongst these people, and then in a also post contact and with sort of Western dress, but so much, it's so much of fashion history has focused on Western dress, and certainly European fashion dominated for centuries, but I think that that's really changing now. So maybe what is fashion? How do we define that in the 21st century? In a global context.
Thank you very much. I've been talking here with Michele Majer of the Bard Graduate Center about fashion, dress, textiles at the BGC. Thank you so much.
Thank you.